Okay, you want to get into it anyway. So, where are we? We have the man blind at birth. And so Jesus has, they've already started with some pretty complex stuff, but things are getting really exciting. Remember, we have a sign, a semeion, and then we have a dialogue. And we're going to get into the dialogue. Also, I'm going to remind you when we get to that section, but you can't forget. We always forget, but you can't forget the stuff that happened before, because it's not a story. It's a history, but it's not just a history. It's a dialogue. It's a logos to telos with an unstated telos. So it's a logical argument, and everything that happens before sets the scene. And you'll see that because we're going to get into that very quickly. And a lot of times I think you'll see, we completely ignore the direct connections that are obvious, especially in the Gospels, because it's not the way we read stuff. It's not the way we look at literature or writing from even a historical standpoint. But we shouldn't. We should be looking at all the little pieces, parts, and how they fit together. So we've got to this statement, which is really interesting. As far as I know, this is the only ego eimi statement made not by Jesus. And so that was the last one we had. Others were making a logical argument that he is the man, he is the blind man from birth. Others are making a logical argument contrariwise. He is similarly to him. He looks similar to him. Not that one there. He made a logical, that is the blind man, the man who's previously blind, made a logical argument. That I am ego eimi. I'm that guy, okay? Stop taking my presence and existence away. Very interesting. And so, this is before the, I don't believe we're before the Pharisees yet, but we're going to get there. So they asked, how then were your eyes open? How then were your eyes open? Okay, logical question. I think they may have already known the answer, but they had to ask the question, right? Therefore, it says they to him, how were your eyes open? Elegon, they were making a logical argument, certainly or accordingly, to him. In what way or how much, certainly accordingly, were opened upwards of you the eyes. I think it's really interesting, this thing about open upward, because you can look at it more than one way. I told you Greek is not euphemistic, so it could mean that, remember, his eyes were like smoke, or like you could tell that he was blind, in other words. So were his eyes open upwards because suddenly you can see his pupils? Or were his eyes opened upwards in the sense that when you're blind, where you look, even if you can't see, where you're looking when you're blind? You ever notice blind people? Yeah. They're always like this, right? Not always, but in general, if you see a blind person, especially with a cane, their faces aren't generally always straight out, right? So is it because now he is looking up because he can see, and there's a reason for looking upward, right? Where before you'd be feeling your way along because they didn't have a means of helping. So in any way, accordingly, they were making a logical argument to him. Accordingly, in what way were your eyes opened upward? I think it's interesting in itself. I don't know if there's a huge amount to take from it, but I think it's great, interesting. It says it in the Greek. Yes, sir.
Greek double entendre.
It could be because you remember in great literature, right? I tell you about this about a poem. All right, yeah, maybe roses are red, violets are blue. Even that might have more than one meaning. But when a kid writes a poem, they have no clue that they're writing multiple meanings, but they figure it out. But when you're reading great poetry that it says one thing, but it means many times something completely different. I guarantee you every psalm is that way because Hebrew is just that way. But yeah, this is a way that you get around that idea of your concrete, very concrete language, but yet how do you express multiple ideas or even ideas that are more than concrete within the context? Because you can also read into this, how were your eyes opened upwards? In what sense is that? In a spiritual sense, right? Although the Greeks would probably say, we don't play that way, right? But yet the insinuation of this is that his eyes, the insinuation especially of John is what? He can, because Jesus healed him, what can he now do? Participate in everything, right? Because theoretically, he can't, can he eat teruma? Theoretically? Can he eat the sacrifice? Can he participate in the temple stuff?
He could never be totally sure that he'd done the mikvah correctly without being able to see.
I think there's a, remember if you remember back when we studied the Torah and they had all this stuff, if you're basically disabled or body or you have disabilities or problems, you're not allowed to participate in teruma or in the services, right? And that, I told you that's why in the ancient times people wore mostly robes, right? They're not running around naked. The Greeks and the Romans did the baths. And part of the problem with doing the baths is, what did you expose? Your body. And if you have any kind of skin issues, can you participate in teruma or in the temple? No. So if you're a Sadducee or Pharisee, you're going to keep those robes on and never take them off, right? Ooh, ooh. And you only have one. But anyway, they were making a logical argument, in what way would your eyes open upward? So, what's he going to say? This may seem simple to us, but it's very interesting that John goes into such detail of recording this for us because it's a setup. It's all set up. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Pretty simple, but that's not exactly what it says in the Greek. Let's look at this is pretty long, but our English translations are shorter. He answered and said, a man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed and received sight. Okay, let's see what it says in the Greek. He concluded for himself. So he thought about what he was going to say. That one there, the man, the logically argued, the legomenos. Okay, this is interesting. The logically argued Jesus. It's not the man called Jesus, the legomenos. If I want to just say he was called Jesus, there's other words in Greek, but it's the logically argued Jesus. Pelon, clay, he made and anointed over, spread over my eyes. And he said to me, that because you lead under into Siloam and you wash, nipse, there's that nipse, nipson, right? Not baptismo. So the important about this is he said to wash. He didn't say to immerse like a mikveh. And by the way, he didn't tell him to go to the pool for mikvahs. He told him to go to the diving swimming pool, right? Having come or went, certainly accordingly, and nipsemios, having washed, I looked up. I looked up. Anablapsa, I looked up. He concluded for himself, that one there, the man, the logically argued Jesus, made clay and anointed over my eyes. And he said to me that you lead under into Siloam and you wash. Accordingly, having went off and having washed, I looked up. In other words, I could see. That goes back to it said he looked upward. Here's the point. Okay, Jesus means God is salvation. Yeshua. It's in Hebrew, it's Yeshua. Jesus means God is salvation. That's Joshua, although Joshua's name is really Jesus or Yeshua, right? God is salvation. Thus, he is logically argued from the standpoint of the blind man. The blind man has said, the man logically argued Jesus. God is salvation. Do you see that? He could have said the guy named Abtamo, the name he's named, right? Jesus, Nomo. His Nomo is Jesus. He could have said he's called Jesus. That's not what he said. The man logically argued Jesus. Now it's interesting. He's not as smart as the lady at the well, right? The woman at the well, because the woman at the well said you are logically argued to be Christ, right? Christus, the Messiah. It's very interesting that he didn't say logically argued to be the Christ, but rather logically argued to be God is salvation. This is again how in Greek you take a very concrete language and the way you state or specify the words, it really means something a little different than in English we go, the one called Jesus? He's a guy called Jesus. No, he was the guy logically argued God is salvation. That's the point it's making. Why Shalom? Okay. All right. When did we hear about Shalom? When did we last know about Shalom? We didn't hear about Shalom, but we know about it. What's the thing that Jesus did just before this that caused the great sign and the great dialogue of a whole 2 chapters? No. This was actually, you had that, and then you had this incident. This incident was Jesus went up for the High Holy Days, right? The Festival of Booths, where the end day is Rosh Hashanah. And what did he do on Rosh Hashanah? What do they do at Rosh Hashanah, the last day of the Festival of Booths?
He stood up and claimed to be the Messiah.
He stood up and claimed to be the Messiah, but what precedes that by moments? Washing the altar with the water from the pool. Okay. Now, our problem is we aren't living in Jewish society and living this, right? If you were living this, you would have been there. I'm going to remind you because I got some really good stuff basic here. Here's from the Mishnah. Shalom comes from shalah, to send or let go, which gives meaning to the entire healing circumstance. That's not part of the Mishnah. This is a commentary that includes that information. Shalom was a pool where the water was taken for Sukkot, the Festival of Tabernacles, Festival of Booths, to cleanse the altar, right? After dipping his pitcher in Shalom's water, the priest would return to the Temple Mount and pour the water into one of the silver basins by the altar. Raise your hand, the people would shout to the priest so they could see that he indeed poured the water into the basin. We'll get to that because this is a huge point. I've already made it before, but we'll get to it again. So what they did at the end, at Rosh Hashanah, at the last day of the Festival of Booths, remember I told you they divide the people would divide themselves. How they did it, I don't know, into 2 groups. One group would go with the priest to the pool of Shiloach, the pool of Siloam. The other group would stay in the temple. The one that went to the pool, they would see the priest, and they would be singing and dancing and everything, and the priest would fill up his ewer, and then he'd carry it, back to the temple, which is a ways. So maybe they helped him. I don't know. But it's, would be a pretty heavy thing. But the priest would take it, and this is what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah in Sukkah says, he was not seen rejoicing in the Shemchat Bet Hashaveh, the water drawing ceremony, has never seen rejoicing in his life. Because that indicates, that they were dancing and they were praising God and all this stuff. Now, around the year 95 BC, the Maccabean king and priest, Alexander Jannaeus, revealed his contempt for the Pharisees by pouring the water on the ground instead of the basin. For this, the people hurled their etrogs at him. That's from Styles. Okay, what does that mean? All right, at the Festival of Booths, this is pretty important stuff within the context, especially the New Testament. At the Festival of Booths, people built their booths, their tabernacles, and they usually put them on the top of their houses, and they lived in them for 7 days. On the last day of the festival, they would take the etrogs. The etrogs were the booths were supposed to be made of 5 different types of branches, palms, figs, whatever. There's 5 different things they make them out of. They take one of each and they carry those on the last day because the next they're going to get rid of their booths, right? They're going to finally sleep in their house for the day after. So they take apart the booths, but they take everybody in the family gets 5, one of each, and they're carrying them. Does anybody remember a parallel to this? What did they do when Jesus came into Jerusalem? This is a representation of that, because blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, which is the last thing that's said, right, at Rosh Hashanah. And what did Jesus say when they said that in the temple? I am, and he said, I am the water of life, which directly relates to the pool of Shiloh and the water. One of the unique ceremonies performed at the temple on Sukkot was the water libation. During the year, libations, that is pouring liquid onto the altar, were always performed with wine. We don't get much of this because the wine libations aren't mentioned much in the Old Testament Torah. If you remember when we talked about the Torah, but the presumption was for every sacrifice, they would pour wine on the sacrifice. So it's part of the sacrificial process. That we don't know the details of the sacrificial process because we don't know how it worked, especially in the times, because people just didn't write that down, right? It happened every day, so why write it down? In any case, the water libation is unique, vehemently opposed by the Sadducees, as we shall see at the end of the Mishnah. We're going to have another quote, I think, here. The water libation functioned as a supplication to God to bring rain in the upcoming season. The Rosh Hashanah, the thing is that the tying of the Torah, Rosh Hashanah, and the Festival of Booths was tied to the idea of requesting water from the heavens to God. Now, there's big reasons for that, but it was seen as a cultural thing that God appropriated. Where have we seen this before? Christmas is really the birth of Mithras, and Easter comes from Hestia because of the celebration of Hestia. This God guy's pretty tricky and smart, huh? He takes the festivals or the things where the people basically worship other gods or worship other things, and what does he do? He appropriates them. We've seen this historically. We generally haven't identified it much in the Torah or the Jewish stuff, but he did, because where did Abraham come from? Abraham's original gods were the moon god. Yeah, exactly. For the land of Ur, they worship the moon. Well, how did this guy that worshiped the moon suddenly start worshiping the God, right? Now, it's really cool because the presumption was that God spoke to him or communicated with him, right? And said, hey, stop. Don't worship this stuff. But what happens, what do we know happens with all, we don't like to think about it because it's true that, a lot of the religious ceremonies and things have some pagan background. But what is it? It's not necessarily the background. It's like what's happening in Paul's time. Paul said, it's okay to participate in the festivals. It's just, what do you do with the festivals?
Get your mind straight.
Yeah. the festivals, instead of being about Dionysus or about, the other gods, celebrate the God, right? And then what happened? You get the celebration of Hestia called Easter that turns into Easter. Easter actually means the festival of Hestia. Did you know that? That's why it's called Easter. It's not called, if you ever wonder, you scratch your head, why would we call it Easter? Because it's the celebration of Hestia from the Greek world. Holy smoke. The Alpha and the Omega are all from Hestia, because that's what the Greeks would write on their hearths every day. When they banked the fire, they put Omega. When they restarted the fire in the morning, they put an Alpha. The Alpha and the Omega were Hestia because she was the goddess of the hearth. The Christians appropriate it through their language and also appropriate it through their worship, which is just God reusing the religious festivals and turning them toward Him. We get kind of, sometimes people go through these things like, right? Because, for example, having Christmas trees, where did that come from? That's from the pagan stuff. Where does having a Yule log come from? Right? And the Christians originally appropriated, quite rightly, the Halloween, right? All Saints Day. But what happened? For some reason, we got back October 31st, right? It's like the day before All Saints Day. Okay, well, let's take it back. Just say it. I think it's really interesting because that's what you see, especially in Christianity, more than any other religion, is it's able to appropriate, cultural festivals and turn them into ones that are very strongly Christian, which I think is really interesting. As I emphasized in other places, the rainy season in Israel is from Sukkot to Pesach. If enough rain does not fall in this period, people's lives they're farmers. They'd be
Not to
toast.
miss your point, but just one interesting thing up above.
Yeah.
You talked about the priest who didn't pour the water on the altar.
Mm-hmm.
And it always sounded like, oh, that was a mistake, he missed or something like that. But it was really, what it says up there was that it was in protest to the Pharisees. I hadn't heard that before.
The Sadducees, I'm not sure why the Sadducees were not happy with making a water libation on the altar. For some reason, that really ticked them off. They really got upset. Remember, Sadducees are the priests, right? So the priests control it. Well, who's really controlling this picture here? In one account, and I couldn't find it to document it, but it said that they ripped the priest apart that didn't dump the water properly on the altar. But all the other ones the ones I've got the historically basis said that they beat them with the air togs, with their branches, which is interesting.
Nice.
Yeah. That still wouldn't be good. It depends how big they are, right? If it's a little one, you're okay. But if it's like this big, yeah, it could be hurtful. Anyway, in the temple, they would pour water into the altar and ask God to bring rain from the heavens to fill the cisterns and underground aquifers below. Now, that is part of what I was saying, the kind of the pagan ideas that began this festival. But in the Torah, we saw how God already had taken this festival as a festival for the temple, because in the High Holy Day, what are they doing? This is the cleansing of the altar. This is when the people are supposed to repent, right? You do your repentance in the time of the Rosh Hashanah. You hear you hear the shofar, right? And they cleanse. What's that? No, I've got the wrong one. Anyway, in Rosh Hashanah, you repent, the altar's cleansed, this is a new year. The next day is the new year in the Jewish calendar. So that's the whole point of this. And it's interesting that, yes, the water, now you might say the Pharisees or the Sadducees were trying to get rid of the whole point of the pagan, water festival, right? But yet in the Torah, it specifies that this is part of that. Well, maybe it doesn't specify. I can't remember back to Torah. Anyway, this was an accepted thing, the cleansing of the altar, and this was that main point of the cleansing altar. So, how was the water libation performed? A golden flask holding 3 logs, which is pretty big. That's like, I think, about 3 gallons, was filled from Siloam, and they arrived at the water gate. It sounded the long blast, a teruah, a staccato note, and then a tikka. The priest then went up the ascent of the altar, turned to the left, where there were 2 silver bowls. Rabbi Judah says they were plaster, but they looked silver because the surfaces were darkened from the wine. They each had a hole like a cylinder snout, one being wide, the other narrow, so both emptied at the same time. The one on the west was for the water, one on the east for wine. If he poured the flask of water into the bowl of wine or into the wine for that water, he has fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Judah says that 1 log he performed the ceremony of the water libation all 8 days. To the priest who performed the libation, they used to say, raise your hand. For one time, a certain man poured out the water over his feet, and all the people pelted him with the etrogs. The water libation ritual would begin with a procession from Siloam, the stream that empties out at the base of the Temple Mount. As we shall see, we learn in the 5th chapter, the procession will begin in the morning after Shemshat Bet Hashova, to be explained below. The people would begin the morning after Shemat. People would make their way to the temple and enter through a designated gate called the Water Gate.
Yeah.
Made much more famous about 2,000 years later because of Jesus. Just as we saw with the Arva ritual, here they blew the 3 shofar blasts. Again, it seems in a way of highlighting the event and emphasizing its importance in light of the fact that others disagreed with its fulfillment. That is, Sadducees, the priests. They would then pour the water into a special bowl that had a hole in it. The water would go down a cistern underneath the altar called Shittim, where, according to legend, it would cause the waters of the deep to rise and nourish the earth. This is interesting stuff. I hadn't read this before. This is from Rabbi. The wine libation was done simultaneously. Rabbi Judah disagrees with the first opinion in the Mishnah concerning 2 matters. The libation was done with a log and not with 3 logs. Secondly, he holds that the water libation was for all 8 days and not just on the 7 days of Sukkot. On the final story of the priest identified the Talmud as a Sadducee pours the water into the floor of the temple rather than pouring it onto the altar. In response, people pelt him with the etrogs. There are several fascinating aspects of the story. First of all, the Sadducean priest disagreed with the water libation. He was still working in the temple. He ended up with a water flask in his hand. If the Sadducees controlled the temple, why did they have a water flask such that he had to cast it down? Why would they have bothered bringing the water up from Shiloh in the first place? If the Pharisees controlled the temple, why would they have let a Sadducean priest perform a ritual when they surely knew he disagreed with? Well, we know the answer to that, right? The Sadducees were all priests. Another interesting point is the people's sentiments clearly lie with the rabbis, the Pharisees. Finally, there's a very similar story in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, Book 13, chapter 13. As Alexander's own people were seditious against him, that's the priest. For the festival which was celebrated, that's the king, the Maccabean. He stood upon the altar and was going to sacrifice. The nation rose upon him and pelted him with citrons, which they had in their hands, because the law of the Jews required that the Feast of Tabernacles, everyone should have branches of the palm tree and citron tree, actually 5, which thing we have elsewhere related. This event occurred during the Hasmonean reign, meaning sometime in the early 1st century, remember 95 BC. Alexander Yanni was king and high priest, was known to have Sadducean leanings. However, there was nothing in Josephus about a water libation. The people pelted him with etrogs because they opposed him as king and high priest. Ooh. Isn't that an interesting twist? That's Josephus' twist. Because they opposed him as being the high priest and king, that's why supposedly this. It's hard to know if the story of the Mishnah is related to the story from Josephus, either historically or literally. Literally. But one thing we can know for sure, if you're a Sadducee in the temple at Sukkot, you better watch your head. That's what he said. That's from a Jewish, that's from Culp. Anyway, I think it's very interesting because this ties it right back, right? And how important was this water libation? And what did Jesus ask the man who was born blind to do? Basically, a water libation, right, from the pool of Siloam, when he had just been, and he said, I am the water of life, right? Ego imi. Holy smoke. So Jesus claims to be the water of life, and in the next sign, what does he do? He uses the same water that was used in libation in the temple to heal this guy. Now, going back, remember I told you there are really interesting elements in this because Jesus took his spittle and part of the cosmos, right? So part of the essence of God and part of the cosmos and put it on this guy's eyes for the purpose of then doing a water libation, a washing, a nipsa, on his eyes. The significance of this, as from a symbolic standpoint, is astounding if you think about it, right? The whole point of this, especially within the context of the time, do you think the people missed it? And what's interesting is Jesus told him to go, right? And he went. And then there's this huge controversy because is this really that guy? And then he said, this guy, Jesus, God's salvation told me to go to Siloam and wash. Do you think they missed it? This is really interesting. Where's this man? Where's this man? They asked him. I don't know. He said, well, okay, that seems pretty simple, right? We know it's not, but yeah, pretty simple. Then they said to him, where is he? He said, I know it. And they said to him, at what point is that one there? He makes a logical argument. I don't stare at him. I don't see him. Like I said, I get a little bit irritated with our translators because they're not going to say, I'm not looking at him. Is there some satire and sarcasm going on here? Right? I mean, the Greek, you're going, right? In the English, you go, okay, I don't know. But in the Greek, he's going, I'm not looking at him. I don't know where he is. You're like, okay, you see this? I think there is some levity. There's, especially in the Greek, you see some levity in the Hebrew just because of the way that the Hebrew is euphemistic. But in the Greek, there's great levity. There's bum all the time. And yet we don't get it because our translators don't give it to us because they want, I guess we got to be dignified.
Took all the sarcasm out.
Yeah, they took all the really fun sarcasm out.
He's kind of flippant with them. You think he'd be scared of him, but he's not. The things he's saying.
These are the people. I don't think we got to the Pharisees yet. Yeah. These are the people. These are the townspeople, right? I think it's important to note. Okay, so you got Jesus doing the sign, and you think a lot of people saw that? Probably a little bit, right? And then you get him obviously coming back to the neighborhood, and now he can see. And some people say, "Is this that guy?" And some people says, "Nah, he just looks like him," right? And then you get this dialogue, right? How did you get healed? Who did it? La la la. And then finally, where is he? I'm not looking at him, right? And so, yes. So is that why the next one is? They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Okay. Enough of you being flippant, enough of your sarcasm. I just point out that a lot of times, we don't give people credit for, obviously this guy was pretty bright. He probably spent his life being sarcastic under his breath because he had, alms for the blind guy, probably giving back. He's probably really a bright mind anyway, because obviously when he has the opportunity, it's like, I'm not looking at him. I just think that's hilarious. they brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. Okay. They lead him. I go. They lead him. Okay. There's some stuff here, right? They lead him forward to the Pharisees. At some point, sometime, to raise the smoke, hence probably darkened, blind. They lead him forward to the Pharisees. At some time, eyes darkened by smoke. I would add the eyes part. That's the way they usually do it in the King James when they add a word to make it clear. In any case, you notice. Okay, do you see this? They didn't. Our translators tell us they brought. Okay, brought. All right. What does the Greek say? They led. Okay. Do you see this? Okay. Again, this isn't euphemistic. Did they need to lead him because he was blind? But they probably took him like, remember, I told you, in general, they didn't grab people. Grabbing people could be considered criminal activity. So what they did is they kind of, somebody got behind you, somebody got beside you, and they kind of helped you, right? So what they talk about Jesus is really interesting in the Greek. So they led him forward to the Pharisees at sometime lies dark by smoke. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Shabbat. This guy, he's breaking the law all the time. Remember the first incident, I think you mentioned it, right? The first one, the guy who was lame and, had his mattress, and he goes, pick up your mattress and peripeto, walk all around. Oh, man. Jesus, you're just causing issues here, right? Now, this guy, he healed him on the Shabbat. We know from before, were they irritated at Jesus for healing a man on the They were really irritated that he told them to pick up his mattress and walk all around. But the ultimate came down to the fact that they didn't like the fact that Jesus healed him on Shabbat. Now, John didn't have to explain this to the readers, the hearers, right? Why? Why didn't he have to explain this about the Sabbath issue to his readers?
Common knowledge.
It was, remember, it's probably Greek and Romans. How was it common knowledge to the Greek and Romans that were hearing the John's gospel, do you think? In the other gospels, remember, especially in Matthew, there's a really strong explanation about breaking the Shabbat, right? The disciples were plucking grain and eating it. That was one thing they were doing. Jesus healed on Shabbat. And it's mentioned not as a sign, a semeion, and then a dialogue. It's mentioned in part of the historical information, the information that's passed on about what Jesus and his disciples did, right? And then it tells us that there was opposition to it because he was doing it on the Shabbat. What was Jesus' answer? You remember back in Matthew? I don't.
You or whatever fell into a well, wouldn't you save them?
Yeah, and where does that come from? It's in the Bible, right?
Old Testament, the Torah?
No, it's not. It's in the Mishnah. It's directly from the Mishnah. The rulings that they made was it's okay to save life and to save animal lives. Now, it does mention in the Torah, it does talk about the specific of the well, but it's applied to all because the Mishnah says this law applies in all cases. So therefore, in the Mishnah, it actually says that you can, for example, a woman who's pregnant, a person who's sick, doesn't have to fast during the fast days. During Sabbath, you can basically, you're supposed to be able to break the Sabbath if you are ill or have special needs, right? This is in the other Gospels, so therefore, I don't have to do what in this Gospel? on how to explain the repetition, because even though it may not be known culturally by the Greeks and Romans, who I think were the main benefactors of this gospel, they already heard it, right? So they're just getting the repeat, and this is kind of cool. So here's the thing. It was the Sabbath in which a period the clay he had made the Jesus and opened up of him the eyes. But it was Sabbath in which a period Jesus had made the clay and opened up his eyes. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on his eyes. The man replied, "And I washed, and now I see." This is the third repetition. Then again, the Pharisees also asked him how he received his sight. He said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I do see." We get kind of an abbreviation. Anew, certainly accordingly, they were making an earnest request. This is interesting. Eroton. Eroton in Greek means make an earnest request. It's not just asking. There's a word in Greek for just to ask. But this is making an earnest request by someone on special footing in a preferred position. Him and the Pharisees, in what way or how much, he looked up, he said to them, "The clay he placed upon of me, on or against my eyes, and I wash. At Nipsimon, I washed, and I look at." So in the English, corrected for the way we read English, accordingly anew, and the Pharisees were making an earnest request of him in what way he had looked up. But he said to them, "He placed clay upon my eyes, and I washed, and I looked at." And I look at. I looked up. Again, look at that. Looked up. So some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep Shabbat." Okay, but others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" Simeon, signs. So they were divided. This is really interesting, right? So you're healed, right? But you didn't do it in the right way. Oh, yes, sir.
Something else occurred to me that they keep repeating the word clay to the Hebrews that had significance. That's the building material that we're made from.
Yeah.
And Jesus used that to heal him, replace his bad eyes with good, basically. So, but maybe the Roman Greeks wouldn't necessarily be as keen on that, but the Hebrews would have been.
That goes back, I said it in a kind of roundabout fashion, but you're right on. Jesus took, the essence, right, spittle from him, which you could say is the essence of God, not breath, but liquid essence, right? And then he mixed it with the cosmos. He mixed it with Adam. Yeah, and I think I mentioned that last week, but the fact that he took Adam, that is the dirt of the cosmos, the creation, and mixed it with the essence of God and put it on the guy's eyes, right? It takes the significance from a magical kind of, thing and puts it into a very obvious, real kind of concept. Because God, as you noted, took Adam and put his nefesh in it. Now, I think it's very interesting that Jesus took spittle, right?
Just again, water.
Which is water, not breath. Now, go back, 3rd chapter, Nicodemus. For it is by water and pneuma, spirit, right? He said you have to be born again with water and pneuma. And what did Jesus just do? He took the cosmos and he took water and used it to heal this guy. The depths of if you want to look at the symbols and the depthness, it's enormous. And the problem is that they're probably even more than we're even thinking of, right? If you just contemplate this, you'll just kind of go, wow, the significance of this is astounding. It's just never as simple as it sounds. In spite of the fact we have a very concrete language and we see very concrete words used, right, to describe this. And you notice it says it 3 times. The author did not only the author didn't want you to miss this, because he could have picked, right? John could have picked when, but he's building this dialogue, the basis for this dialogue based on the Semeion, what happened, right, in history. So I think it's pretty amazing. So let's see what it says in the Greek. Here's the King James, pretty long piece in Greek. Therefore, says some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them, which is a funny division because they know that the Mishnah allows the healing on a Shabbat. The Mishnah does. And even the readers, okay, so they already cast the Pharisees. The Pharisees are eternally cast as the bad guys, and the Sadducees too. But the hearers of this, right? The hearers of this gospel, they know the punchline. They know about the other gospels. They know, they've probably been told. Remember, what did Paul tell them? Why did you not need to make sure that the Gentiles were all instructed in the Torah and all the learning and memorize the Torah before they became Christians? Because why? No, he gave it an even simpler reason. His quote was, because every Shabbat, the Torah is taught by the rabbis. The Torah is taught. Therefore, accept them based on their being convinced of Christ, right? And they will what? They'll learn. And therefore, that's why we have, what do we call it? We have our own confirmation class, right? In the ancient world, they would do confirmation, when a person joined the Christian group, the Tenotus group. In this case, and their confirmation would probably be come to Shabbat, right? And the rabbi, of course, the problem is you're trying to understand it in Hebrew. No, they're probably doing it in Greek, right? Even though it's illegal today in Shabbat, they're not supposed to read the scriptures. They're supposed to read it in what? Hebrew, right? But in that day, what do you think they read it in? Right out of Septuagint, right out of LXX, because that's what they had. That's what they knew, and also communicated to the people. Again, why was it so easy for the Greeks and the Romans to acclimate to this teen hodos? Is because the language was there, the people were there, the educational structures were there. Pretty amazing, right? I think it's kind of astounding. They were making a logical argument, certainly accordingly, from out or among the Pharisees, some or any person, not he from God, a man, that are because the Sabbath he doesn't guard, he doesn't terai. Others, but we're making a logical argument in what way or how is he powerful or able, a man who missed the mark of such a kind, semeia, supernatural ceremonial indications to make or do, and a split or gap there was in of them. Accordingly, some from out of the Pharisees were making a logical argument. The man is not from God because he does not guard the Sabbath. Straight out. But others were making a logical argument in what way he, a man who misses the mark, is powerful to do supernatural ceremonial indications of such kind, and a split there was in them. Okay, however you take this, this is a beautiful Greek satire, unstated telos, right? And all the Greek people that are listening, all the Greek and Roman people that are listening to this, and all probably the culturally aware Hebrews that are listening to this are like, yeah, right? Because they know the answer. The unstated telos is They know that the Shabbat allows you to heal. And just because this guy is doing miraculous signs, right? What should your answer be? Heal me too, right? Heal the rest of us. Come on, come, you can come help. My mother-in-law, said Peter, who's sick, right? And cursed by Zeus, by the way. And Jesus healed her. I think it's beautiful. And also, I want to point out something. You know, in all the other times when we talk about healing, it really doesn't, the words that are used are really not healing in a sense that we think about it. Like, for example, someone didn't have typhus or cholera or a sickness or cancer. They had no idea what these were. These were all curses, right? But this, what was it? It's like the man who was lame. You probably could tell he was lame because, why? His leg probably looked like it was unable to support him, and he was unable to support himself. So in the Greek worldview and the Roman worldview, and even in the Hebrew worldview to a certain standpoint, these are physical ailments. The man who was lame, he could have become lame by birth, it doesn't say. He could have become lame by what? Accident. Something could have fallen on him. In the Greek worldview, if an accident happens to you, especially an accident in war, not accident, you get whacked, right? And your leg is injured in warfare. What is that? That's a sign of as long as it's not in your back, right, where you're running, that's a sign that you're not a coward, that you're a hero to the Greek people. And therefore, the Greeks saw no problem with healing physical ailments. On the other hand, if you got a sniffles and a sickness, where'd you go? You're Slepion, right? Because you were cursed. The man who was born blind is an interesting case because in the Greek and Roman and even the Hebrew worldview, he was cursed and his family was cursed. His parents were cursed. His ancestors were cursed. That's what the first question the disciples asked. Who sinned? Right? This man or his parents? That he was born blind. Wow. Who was cursed? The Greeks and Romans would say he was cursed. Why? Not because of anything he did. Why did the gods curse him in the Greek and Roman worldview?
He was fated.
He was fated. That is correct. That is so correct from the animistic viewpoint of the world. The gods just do whatever they want. And the gods are fated and you are fated. And your fate is written. What is really important about Christianity, and this is the reason I'm really anti the Calvinist viewpoints of any kind, because Calvinism says you are fated. Yet predestination means that you're fated. Any kind of predestination means you're fated. But yet, what is the message of Christianity? You're not fated. You're convinced of Christ, and therefore you become heirs to salvation. That's what Jesus says. It's beautiful stuff. Anyway, this is an internal proof text via an unstated telos. Notice the statement, in which way is he a man who missed the mark, is powerful, able, or possible to do supernatural or ceremonial indications of such a kind? The unstated telos is no man can do this. And therefore, this is not just a proof text. Remember the whole previous dialogue? The whole previous dialogue gave us like 5 ways that prove that Jesus was God, right? This doesn't need to prove it, but it just did using the words of whom? Yeah, the Pharisees themselves, just in an unstated telos, said that this in what no man who's a sinner can do this. So therefore, Jesus is either not a sinner or he's not a man. But he is man, right? He's all man and he's all God. So what does that mean? The Roman and Greek audience who are hearing this, do they get it? Yeah. You know, we just reread these things over and over again. I think it's really funny because once we see it kind of in this context, as the Logos tells us, we see, then they turned again to the blind man. Okay, whether they realize it or not, they just conclude that Jesus is God and that he's powerful and able to do this. So they turned to the blind man. What have you got to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. Okay, this is going to get him in trouble. You know it. Here's the King James that said to the blind man again, what sayest thou of him? That he hath opened thine eyes. He said he's a prophet. All right, in Greek, they made a logical argument, certainly accordingly to raise the smoke, darken my smoke, the blind anew. Who, what, or why you make a logical argument through all over of him, that is because he opened up of you the eyes. But he said that is because a foreteller, a prophet, he is. Absolute identity, right? Accordingly, they made a logical argument anew to the darken my smoke, the blind. What you make a logical argument through all over him because he opened up your eyes. What you make a logical argument through him because he opened up your eyes. But he said that he is a foreteller. So in other words, the question is, logically, why, how did he open your eyes? Why and how? It's all implied within this context that the question words that are used in the Greek, it can be who, which, what, or why. We pick what, but the point is, the question is why or what? Why did he heal you? Why did he do this? And the guy said he is a foreteller. Remember his first point, he logically argued that he is God of salvation. He is Jesus, which is really an interesting statement. Probably not a good thing to come out and say, well, I think he's the Christ. Of course, this guy wasn't as smart as the woman at the well, but that's okay. Maybe he's smarter because they would have whacked him probably. Maybe, well, it's going to be too late for him anyway. There's some things that are worse than death in these first century cultures. Oh, go to where I want it to go. Anyway, they still did not believe that he had been blind. They still did not believe he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. All right, I guess, let's see, we got 1 minute, so we could probably go through this. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called his parents to him that had received his sight. Okay, nor not, they were convinced of a logical argument. Certainly, the Judeans, through of him, that is because he had been, to raise the smoke, blind, and he had looked up, until, during which the same time, they emitted a sound to the parents, the male ancestors of him, of the anablapsos of having looked up. Accordingly, Judeans, blind in Judea, were not convinced of a logical argument, threw all over him that he had been darkened by smoke, they'd been blind, and he had looked up, until during which same time, they emitted a sound to his parents of the having looked up. So we'll continue from there, but the big deal here is, remember they were fighting about whether this guy was really the blind guy? They're still fighting about whether he's the blind guy. So they want proof. So what are they going to do?
Go to the source.
They go to the source. They brought his parents. We'll get into this, but this is really I mean, okay, do you see how funny this is? I mean, there is great humor in this. This is stand-up comedy routine, but still at the same time, it's very serious, right? But I think that you can see in the Greek, it's just got this beautiful irony, beautiful satire that just keeps coming out, right? And I don't think it's supposed to be laugh out loud funny, but I'm sure that the people that are hearing this in the first century, they got to be chuckling, right? They got to be entertained by this. And it is really an important point. But anyway, thank you, Father, for your word. I pray you look at it this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
We're out of town next weekend, so no
Uh-oh.
class next Sunday.
Oh, no.
It's a cliffhanger.
The cliffhanger.